Hey everyone, thanks for coming today. So I'm Emma and I'm a senior writer at Creative Review magazine, which for anyone that's not familiar is an online and print magazine in London, and we write about the creative industry, which means photography, illustration, design, branding, and we've been doing that for just over 40 years. Um, as Jolie said, the question of whether you work for free is something that comes up all the time, and a lot of young creatives and new creatives struggle with that. Uh, Before we get into the conversation, I think it's important to say that there's some clear laws around things like unpaid internships and work experience. And I can share a couple of links at the end that kind of go into details on those. But basically, if you're doing an internship, you're turning up to work every day and your employer has work for you and you've agreed that, that means they should be paying you minimum wage legally. For illustrators, photographers, and artists that are working maybe more on their own terms, it's really important to grapple with the question early on, and I think maybe lay out some boundaries for yourself to make sure you're not being taken advantage of and that the projects you're doing are valuable for your career, if not financially, then at least creatively. And lastly, there isn't really a single right answer to the question. People will come up with different answers depending on their situation. Some people might have the kind of financial support to be able to work for free, others won't, or maybe they're balancing a non-creative job to earn money while they build up their creative career. So I'm going to launch straight into it. And I thought, Stephen, you could get us started. Why is it still a question? Why is this idea of whether you should work for free is still a question that comes up?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Thanks, Emma. And it's nice to be invited to chat on this, by the way. Just as a little bit of context, as well as Emma said what she did, I work for an advertising agency called BBH, and I'm head of production there. But in my past life, I've been a photo director at various magazines, including Dazed. So I'm very familiar with this question. And that kind of informs my answer, really. Why is it? It's still a question because of the commercial model for the editorial market. So specifically in terms of photography, why do photographers get asked to work for free? Magazines, and particularly independent magazines and publishing, their commercial model really relies on advertising. They don't really make money from selling copies of their magazines. So the way that they essentially attract advertising is to obviously work with some of the best creative talent, and they essentially, the commercial model means that they don't have a huge amount of budget to actually pay photographers for their services. It's something which has moved on a little bit, I think, hopefully, particularly in light of some of the events of the last year. But essentially that idea of offering exposure or platform in return for no money is something which is still really prevalent in that industry. And also just quickly to say, Emma, I think it's really relevant that you talk about some of the wider questions around things like internships and people still being asked to work regularly in a role for free is something which is now in the main illegal and shouldn't actually be tolerated across the board. But yeah, particularly for photographers, it's still a construct because essentially magazines often don't have the budget, or the way that they are commercially set up doesn't allow them to actually pay photographers for their contributions.
Thanks, Stephen. Serena, over to you. Is it ever right to work for free, in your opinion? What are your thoughts on this dilemma?
I think, like you said before, it is such a big question. I think the short answer is no, and I don't think it should be encouraged that we should have to work for free to get somewhere within our career. I think the longer answer is probably it depends who's asking you to work for free. I've kind of made a bit of a hard rule that if it's a brand or an actual client or someone who is going to use my work to make a profit, it doesn't make sense that I should have to work for free. If it's someone else that is going to allow me to create work that's going to be like strong for my portfolio, allow me to like have whole creative control, but also just create a body of work that I'm going to be happy about, then I might do it for free, because for me there's value there. But I think it depends. It's such a personal question, I think, because everyone deems certain things valuable to them that might not be valuable to someone else. So I think, yeah, I think we do need to get out of the system of expecting people to work for free. I don't think it should really be a question anymore because of how not inclusive it is to have a standard like that.
Yeah, agreed. And it tends to divide people into camps of who is able to, who is unable to.
Yeah.
Creates this kind of horrible hierarchy. I wondered, Serena, have you been asked to work for free? You know, as a kind of new and up and coming photographer, how many times has that request come through?
A lot. It still comes through a little bit now, to be honest, but not as much. It was mainly when I graduated university and didn't have like any kind of foot in the door at the time. I was working in retail and kind of happy to take anything that kind of swung my way because it made me feel like I was being like productive towards my career, or like I was kind of in a stagnant place of like, I don't want to work in retail for the rest of my life. So anything that's creative, I'm going to do it and just see where it takes me. And really now I look back, I see how I was like exploited 100%, and that wouldn't have ever been sustainable. Like if I wasn't where I was now, if I was still working a side job, I wouldn't have had the time or had the money to be able to just take on that quantity of free work. So yeah, I think it still happens, but I definitely don't tolerate it as much as I did before. And I kind of wish that I didn't think at the time I needed to as well.
Yeah, I guess it's hard looking back on those decisions not to kind of beat yourself up a bit. But when you're new and you're given these opportunities, it's hard to say no, right?
Yeah, it's always a lesson, isn't it? Like I'm still making like a gazillion mistakes every day at work. I'm sure in a year's time I'll be like, oh, yeah, so it happens.
I'm curious, question for both of you. When people approach artists or photographers with a project and there's no budget associated or job and there's no money associated, should it always just be an outright no? How should people handle that situation when they're asked?
Serena, do you want to?
I think it shouldn't always be an outright no. I think it is like a personal decision on what you value about that situation. So there's people who may come to me now and ask me to work for free, or I might approach someone and work for free, like do something that isn't going to financially benefit me, but I see the value in creating work that I want to make. And where I now have the luxury of actually having paid commissions, I feel like I do have the privilege of being like, oh yeah, I'll do that for free because I feel like I'll be able to have a little bit of control about the situation, which I don't necessarily have with commissions. But that obviously isn't the case for everyone. So it shouldn't be a standard. So I guess it depends. If you've been asked to work for free and you're really excited about it and you want to do that for you, then sure, do it. But I don't generally know. It's a hard question. But yeah, I think it's not an outright no, but most of the time it should be a no, especially if it's from a brand.
I think that's an amazing answer, and I think from my point of view, from obviously not being a photographer, but I mean, there's a much bigger moral decision, isn't there, in terms of all of these decisions. And Serena, you said right up top, which I think is the most relevant thing, that it creates an unequal, unlevel playing field. Obviously, as we know, the creative industries, photography, moving image, are totally unrepresentative of the not just the ethnic makeup of the UK, but also socioeconomic, so many different underrepresented characteristics. And if someone's approaching you to ask you if you can work for free and you were able to do it because of your particular situation, then you have to, I suppose, as an artist, consider the fact that you are creating or at least you're kind of helping to support, maybe unknowingly, and I think that's a lot of it, maybe unknowingly, a system where brilliant, amazing emerging talent, which is being, trying to break through, it is not going to be supported in terms of the work that they're doing, which just seems, it just seems to make it harder for us to break this cycle that we're in as an industry where, I can't relate it in terms of facts and figures in photography essentially, but we're doing a lot of work at the agency at the moment in terms of film, to try and diversify the director talent we're working with. There are so many essentially artists who are in privileged positions who are able to, for years and years and years, self-support and pick and choose opportunity for, that comes along without needing to be paid for it. And I think that, it's on all of us really together, obviously, to try and change the model as it is. But it's hard. It's really hard. And I remember even from days of Dazed, when a big opportunity would come along to, essentially to shoot potentially a very well-known individual that a photographer might be really keen on, might be a music artist or a film actor or someone for a cover story with a very, very low budget attached to it. And that's another thing we should talk about a little bit. When you say for free, there's a fee and there's an out-of-pocket expenses thing as well. It's one thing not getting paid a fee to contribute to a really, prestigious title, but to not get out of pocket, to literally spend on materials and go out of pocket to support a title like that, I think is just, it's mind blowing. I can't think of an industry where you'd go into it and someone would say, I will have that steak, but then I will also contribute the ingredients as well. Oh, you'd like me to cook it as well? I will actually do that. I can't really think of a like for like industry, and it makes it hard because obviously for a photographer, there might be value in you having that particular personality in your portfolio. It may help you get commercial work. That might be the case, but we always have to ask ourselves, are we essentially just contributing to a very problematic end of the industry by working for free? Sorry, it's a very long answer. It's complex.
Yeah, it's very complicated, hence why there's never a single easy answer that can apply to everyone, I think. But something I've kind of learned from interviewing artists and photographers is that sometimes it's a question of a trade-off. So if you're not going to be paid what you deserve for a job, you at least get the opportunity to have freedom of creative expression, which sometimes you don't always get in big commercial campaigns. You might get a big budget, but you kind of are constrained in what you're allowed to do. Serena and Stephen, what are your thoughts on that? Is it a case of if there's no money, you at least need to make sure you've got that creative freedom? And does that kind of make the fact that it's an unpaid job slightly more palatable, perhaps?
I think in an ideal world, I always say that you should obviously be paid for any work that you're doing, but in a practical, my experience sense of the situation, I always kind of look for three things in a job: whether I'm gonna have financial gain, whether it's gonna help me build a relationship, and whether I'm gonna be able to include it into my portfolio and for it to be work that I'm proud of. And I think for any job that comes my way, I try and make sure at least two of those things are there for it to be worth my while. So in an instance where there isn't any money, it definitely needs to be like work I'm going to love and a relationship that's going to be built from that. So that's kind of how I tackle the situation, because I feel like it always comes around again and again, and it helps me to kind of decide what's going to be worth my while, basically.
That's an incredibly brilliant solution to try to tackle quite a complex question. I think if you try and always go back to what the purpose of doing things, and we're talking quite a lot here obviously about editorial, I think, and maybe we're talking about working with younger brands who don't have budgets and stuff as well, but editorial was the old system in terms of editorial. It was a shop window, it was a place to display your wares, and you kept up your currency as a photographer by contributing to brilliant creative titles that the commissioners would look at as well, ad agencies would take notice of, and it'd get you more and more commissioning work. And I think, Serena, we had a very brief chat just before the call, we're talking about the value of that, that kind of exposure. And so many photographers these days have their own brands and their own platforms and their own huge followings as well. So if there's value in doing it, and it sounds like those three criteria are really, really important, then I guess it probably, one of the biggest ones probably still is that can the creative freedom that you're talking about, Emma, can it really help develop your brand, and it can really kind of bolster who you are as an artist? And also, not all photographers, I guess, do want total creative freedom. It's quite often used in fashion as a bit of a sort of carrot to lure people in, as in, you come on over, you can kind of do what you want for this one conceptually, but what you tend to find, especially in fashion, is it's so controlled by the credit system, in terms of the advertisers that advertise in the magazines get a certain number of credits, and those clothes have to be featured, that often this idea of creative freedom isn't quite as potentially as kind of, and Serena, you might know more about that than I, but isn't necessarily always as kind of obvious as it appears to be. There can be constraints that you're not even aware of, I suppose, when you take the brief.
I think exposure is a word that comes up a lot when jobs are unpaid. That's how creatives are lured in. They're promised incredible exposure. Serena, we were talking a bit before we started this. You were saying that it's kind of a false promise in a way.
Yeah, I think, sorry, can I have 2 seconds? My fridge is just beeping. I'll be back.
Yeah. Stephen, would you agree that exposure is a bit of a false promise as well in some cases?
Well, I think it's one of those things that's sort of lingered around, isn't it? It's kind of been there since the 90s, this idea of exposure, before we all had the ability to be able to, show people what, photographers and artists, what we could do personally just on our own platforms. When you couldn't do that, you needed a vehicle to show people. So if you assume for the Observer Life or for Sleaze Nation or Dazed or Wonderland or whatever it was literally on the newsstands, and it was like this vehicle to be able to show your ideas. And I think in those days, the idea of exposure, that's brilliant. That's really, really relevant. Still quite relevant. Obviously, if you shoot the cover of a magazine, that is exposure. But, Serena's got a brilliant Instagram following. Lots of, brilliant photographers are really incredibly smart the way they edit and curate and show their work. And arguably, it's starting to tip in terms of the balance is starting to tip in terms of the artist in that sense. So I guess it's complex. It kind of depends what it is, but I don't think exposure is always that relevant.
No, I don't think anytime I've ever been promised exposure, I don't think I've ever got exposure, to be honest, to be completely frank. That's such a red flag for me. Anytime I hear exposure, I just switch off now, because there's no way that they can really promise any kind of exposure, or, you're going to get work from this after this. Like, they can't promise that realistically. It's such an empty promise. I think the only time I've actually gained exposure is from me proactively creating work, and not necessarily like for someone else, but like I'll invest in film or whatever to like do a job, create personal work for myself, basically. And that's gained me way more exposure than working on someone else's idea for like an empty promise of exposure. Like, especially at the start of my career, like I really, really thought like exposure was gonna like make me fly in the creative industry, the way people were selling it to me. But that definitely did not happen. So yeah, I just ignore anything that says a promise of exposure from doing free work.
Are there any other red flags, Serena, that you've learnt to watch out for?
Yeah, I think another big one is just if someone's going to ask you to work for free, I think they should lay that out plain and clear from the very beginning. I think anyone who doesn't do that or like beats around the bush that's probably another red flag, because you really need an explanation for why they want you to work for free. Like, then there isn't really an excuse, but if they're going to have an excuse, it should probably be a good one. So yeah, that's probably the two biggest things. If they're not really explaining the money situation after a few emails in, like, it's probably not worth your time.
Just thinking about exposure as well, Serena, do you find that things like your own Instagram account and your own social media is actually more valuable in terms of that now than maybe a job with a big magazine or a big brand might have been in the past?
I think so. I'm still like, don't really have a clue what I'm doing with my Instagram. I'm kind of at a good place with it, but I think, to be honest, most of my work does come from my Instagram, and most of just engaging with people or like having weird relationships of like just following someone and that, you're on their radar just through doing that, has been really, really helpful to me. It kind of like breaks that initial like, oh, I don't know who you are. It's like they kind of do, because they've had a look at your work, and vaguely before you meet, you kind of understand what someone's about and like what their work is about. So yeah, I think definitely Instagram's probably like the biggest tool for me at the moment, in terms of just getting my work out there. And also just like, there's a lot to be said for just getting your personality out there as well, like even just putting out behind the scenes work and just getting a wider picture of who someone is going to work with as well can often like get me jobs, which is nice.
I think you mentioned as well the fact that one of the trade-offs if work is unpaid is that maybe it will lead to a longer term relationship. Do you kind of find situations where brands or magazines get in touch maybe early on in their existence? They might not have budget, or they might have tiny budget to begin with. But actually, if you build that relationship over time, it can be more rewarding financially.
Yeah, I think, well, yes and no. I think the standard should be that they approach with a lower budget, which you then build a relationship with them and it becomes a higher budget. I don't think you should start off at zero, but I do think, yeah, that does often happen, and it's happened to me. And it's kind of nice to grow with like clients as well and like have that relationship continue. But yeah, I don't want to encourage someone to do that thinking that everyone's going to become a massive company that's going to pay off in the future, because it's probably not the case. But I think it's always worth, just even if they don't have much money, to be paid something.
Question for both of you: what if it's your dream commission? What if your dream magazine approaches you but the budget is non-existent or almost non-existent? Stephen, how do you handle it?
I think if I was Serena Brown, I think I'd use her brilliant 3 questions, because I think that's probably the same criteria probably applies. But just quickly, by the way, on the other one, you were talking about red flags, and something just occurred to me that it's really important. I totally agree. I think transparency and on the commissioner's part is absolutely crucial, and not just in terms of what the commission, whether there's budget and production budget or fee, but also what the use of that is. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors that happens, particularly with smaller kind of independent titles, around things like paid advertorials, where brands are actually bringing budget into magazines to actually pay to feature their clothes. It happens a lot in fashion. You need to be really clear on what the usage is for those things. You need to be very, very, very clear on that, because I think a lot of photographers probably get slightly taken for a ride on that front in terms of where their images are actually going to be used as well. And it's just, if there's anything suspicious in terms of that communication, I know so many photographers who are trying to help out who don't have agents or don't have that point of contact to actually be able to kind of speak to someone and take that advice. Then I would just walk away from it, because I think you can tell very early on in those exchanges whether someone is legit and someone is actually going to be able to give you sort of straightforward answers that you need. In terms of I would literally go back to, again, Serena's criteria. I think that if you think you're going to derive a huge amount of creative benefit from the assignment which is being presented to you, or you think you can bring something to it which is going to elevate your work, or I always say with photographers, very much so, that the portfolio, the immediate portfolio, your commercial portfolio, is like it's like a projection of where you want to go to, rather than necessarily where you've been. So a lot, which sounds a bit abstract, but this idea of, if you're presented with an opportunity, even if there's not potentially money attached to it, but you think it's going to point you in a new direction, or help shape your body of work, or even change the perception of who you are, or how you're seen as an artist, then I obviously, clearly there's still value in doing it, but that you have to always look at it in terms of that criteria of, what are you doing? What does this mean for the wider industry if you're taking this and you're just working for free? If someone, magazines should be able to pay contributions to photographers, and we'll talk about it a bit later on as well, but photographers, it might be 45 minutes with a celebrity which gets you a cover and 4 inside pages. The only reason that you can do that and make a beautiful, brilliant portrait or set of pictures is because you've spent 10 years of your life investing in your skills and your experience to be able to bring that all to the room in 45 minutes and execute that. So it's part of a much bigger equation of you're bringing so much experience to be able to take that picture for that magazine, which is then going to elevate their brand. So I think it's just, you have to always evaluate it as part of a sort of the bigger picture.
I think that's true for, sorry, Serena.
No, I was just going to say, I feel like a lot can be said for I've done it where I've been like, oh my God, I'm so excited to work for this person, but really the client should be just excited to have you working for them. And it's easy to kind of put them on a pedestal and be like, oh, okay, like I will do anything you want because you're my dream client. But, you know, it is a collaboration at the end of the day. And if they really want you to work for them, they'll pay you. That's kind of how it should be, really.
I agree.
I think all of this applies to unpaid internships as well. You know, it's important that your potential employer be transparent with you and clear about what the parameters are, where something could be leading, and respectful of your worth as well. Stephen, I wanted to ask you about that because we've spoken before and you've had some kind of encouraging words on how important it is for creatives to value their worth. You know, yeah, there are lots of people that will try not to pay you, but there are an awful lot of other people that will want to pay you, which is really important to remember because it's so disheartening when, you know, you're approached to do jobs and there's no budget associated. So Stephen, this idea of self-worth, tell us about that.
Well, listen, it's the hardest thing, isn't it? Because, like Serena, like you said, you were working in a different job, and you know, I was trying to further yourself in terms of your photography career. At the same time, silence for any artist, any creative, is like a vacuum, and it's, you know, it can affect your confidence. But have no doubt whatsoever in terms of your self-worth to any brand, to any, you know, kind of editorial title. I think I can't emphasize enough that any creative agency or any associated industry that's offering an unpaid internship is just morally and ethically wrong. It shouldn't happen. There should be a way of them being able to, I mean, we're talking minimum wage here. There should be a way of them being able to fulfill a minimum commitment to you in terms of paying you. You know, again, so much of what you do as a director, a photographer, you know, an artist, you know, all of your formative training, all of your, whether you've done higher education, you're assisting, all of those things all adds up to that 45 minutes or that 3 hours on set and in the room at that time. Like, the pressure of that situation should not be you know, kind of disregarded in any sense. And I think that you just have to continue and believe the fact that brands, magazines are hungry for images, they're hungry for that content, because that's the thing which gives them value, you know, to an audience, and you're the person that's going to provide that. So you have to value yourself. You really, really do. You have to value the skills that you're going to bring. And Serena's right. They should be paying, you know, particularly brands, even if you're a challenger, an upstart, a brand new fashion label, you know, the newest thing on the block, you know, the best skate brand. I actually sound like an old man now, but I think, you know, they should be able to pay you. They're selling a product to a market, you know, whether we like it or not. We live in a capitalist society where they're selling something they've made to a market and they're generating a margin on that. You are selling something to a brand. You are selling a product to a brand, which sounds quite crude, but as an artist, when you're working commercially, you are selling a product to a brand. So I don't think you should ever underestimate how important it is to keep that value of, you know, sort of self-worth.
Yeah, Stephen is 100% right. Like, the person who's contacting you is being paid to do what they're doing. So it's the same thing. But just back to like internships, I've done an unpaid internship and a paid internship, and like I've definitely found that the paid internships were way more invested in trying to help me like establish my career and supportive of me, whereas unpaid internships have been a lot more like, here's your work for the day, goodbye. So I was really fortunate. I found an internship at Refinery 29, I think 6 months after I graduated, which was paid at like London living wage for 3 months, and I stayed there for 6 as an intern. But they were like fantastic and like giving me as many opportunities as I can whilst I was there, and just kind of chucking me into every room. And even like now I'm freelance, the people that I met there are constantly supporting me, like constantly bringing my name up in rooms. And there's so much to be said for like peer-to-peer like collaboration, because those people will constantly be like, yeah, saying your name in rooms that you wouldn't even imagine. So there's a lot to, I guess finding the right internships is so hard, and finding people who will actually pay you and support you is super hard. But I think there's a shift that's happening, and there's a lot more internships that are really beneficial to creatives. I think people are trying a bit harder now.
Yeah, I think so. What's your advice for when you've been given a sort of offer for something that's unpaid? How would you advise either politely declining or maybe seeing if you can negotiate to something a bit higher?
Depends what mood I'm in, but I feel like most of the time I'd probably just be like, thank you for considering me, but I don't take on unpaid work. If you are able to adjust your budget, like, feel free to get back in contact with me. I'd probably just phrase it something like that, because for them to have approached me for free work, there's kind of already a sour taste in my mouth, and I don't think they're someone that I really want to work with anyway. So that's how I'd probably just be a bit petty about it. Like, it's just not really worth your time, to be honest, if someone's gonna approach you like that. But I think you can still be polite about it. Again, like we've said before, you don't know where relationships go, like whether they're like, oh, okay, actually I've got some money now, so I can pay you because I still really want you to work for us. So yeah, just be polite. It's always be nice to people.
Polite but firm.
Yes, definitely.
I feel like when you kind of muster up the courage to be polite but firm and say no, it's nice to know that you're kind of supporting all the other creators and photographers in a way, because you're making it harder for these companies to then get a yes from someone else.
Yeah, it's you've just got to make them think twice about doing it again.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, and also you have to remember, sometimes the people that are sending those emails are young commissioners, or young within their organisation. They might not realise even what they're doing. They might have been told to do that by their boss, and just not realise quite the way that this thing actually works. So yeah, polite is that's very, very generous of you. Yeah, but we've seen it more, haven't we, recently? I've seen on various websites where actually people are calling people out for it. I saw, there's a couple of fashion titles in particular where they'd approached photographers with an advertorial and offered a very, very, very low fee in comparison with the fee that they were going to get as a magazine, and people have been calling people out for it. So you could straddle a line between being polite and the occasional person calling out titles, but it has to change, right? It has to change. The model is broken.
People, I fully support people calling people out as well. I'm just super aggressive, but I think those people are fantastic, and I think it should continue. And like, again, like, Instagram is so good for that, like, making clients quiver in their boots, because suddenly like thousands of people know that you're trying to rip people off. So yeah, it's quite good to see.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed more of that, and actually creatives calling out certain companies for just not paying invoices, which is effectively promising to give you paid work and then it turns into unpaid work. So it's encouraging to know that these things aren't just kind of being allowed to slide by so easily anymore. I think I have one last question for you guys before we go on to questions from everyone, which was about, realistically, a lot of people have to balance different jobs. Maybe you're doing something uncreative while you're trying to get your portfolio going, or trying to find a creative role. And that's totally fine, right? To be balancing these two things. And yeah, is that something that either of you have experience of doing yourselves?
Well, yeah, like I said, I used to do it. From like my own personal perspective, I think it's unfair that someone from a lower income background is going to have to do that when other people aren't. And therefore I don't really think it's sustainable, because I know for my mental health I wouldn't have been able to juggle doing both. And initially I was doing something uncreative, and then went on to doing something creative, but still juggling being a freelancer and working Monday to Friday was still like too much for me. So yeah, I think it is about creating an industry with a level playing field, and not having this expectation. Like, I think especially through university, I was really just told, like, you're gonna have to do this if you're gonna make it, you're gonna have to do that. And it's kind of getting rid of those tropes, because people shouldn't have to struggle for money to do a creative job.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've got I actually did a photography degree and made it for about a year and a half in London doing 2 bar jobs and working in Fresh and Wild. And I took sort of quiet editorial portraits that paid about £50 a page. So I didn't make it. I ended up going off into production. But I agree, it's about it's not fair if there are certain parts of the kind of creative industries who flourish because they're supported and they're able to sit around and wait for 5 years and wait for that the right bus to come along and get on that bus and go on and make it. So it's a bottom up thing in this industry, sadly. It's about making sure that the opportunities at the emerging end are correctly paid and paid for appropriately, because once you make it obviously into the upper echelons of being established and you have a good client list and you're making a healthy living, it's fine, but that's no good. It's uneven in terms of people who are entering the market, and that's why just look at look at photography and film. I mean, it's totally disproportionate to the population of the country that we live in. It's totally disproportionate. That won't change until people are properly supported in terms of the work they're doing.
Yes, very much agreed, Stephen. I'm going to move on to questions now, if that's okay with everyone. So the question from Jack, who's asked, Serena, if you think that the free work that you got helped you get paid work in the long run. Sorry, helped you to get follow-on paid work.
Not follow-on paid work. I think free work I've done was good for developing my practice, giving me opportunities to just shoot a variety of things, I guess building my portfolio. But you can do that without doing it for someone else, if that makes sense. Like, you can come up with your own concepts, and I think that kind of gives you a body of work that is truly representative of you anyway. I definitely had like a portfolio, but it was crazy. Like, it didn't really like align properly with, I guess, the work that I like to make necessarily. So yeah, it's a good way of, I guess, getting out there and meeting people, whatever, but I wouldn't say it really directly gave me paid work in the end.
Cool. I've got a few questions from Max, Freya and Katie. One of them is about the best way to discuss terms of work. So let's say you're about to get a job, but they only offer you exposure. Should someone be afraid of not being chosen for that job because someone else is okay to work for free?
Well, I think we'll probably agree to say that you shouldn't be afraid of that, because if you do take that, you're essentially, you are just sort of unfortunately continuing the model as it is. I like to think of exposure, actually, there's that other horrible connotation of it as someone who's sort of freezing to death in the Antarctic through too much exposure. I think like we've said, I think exposure as a offer of payment is just not really valid. It doesn't really mean anything. So I think if someone is contacting you and saying, here's the commission, plenty of exposure, brilliant platform, lots of attention, great artists, up and coming bands, you never heard of them before, I don't really think that is something, I wouldn't advise that is something people sort of take on. And I would get into the habit of just being very direct in response to those things and having in your head, this is a kind of editorial day rate I'd like to earn. This is a minimum kind of commercial day rate I'd like to earn, which by the way doesn't include any potential usage. And this is kind of what I can do a job for. If I've got kit, this is what I want to charge for it. Just having those basic things in place so you don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel every time, so you can kind of respond with something, I think would be, from my point of view, would probably be really, really helpful.
Yeah, if you kind of look at it as if enough people say no to that person, then no one's going to do it for free. Like, you can't become that person who does it for free because you're scared someone else is going to do it for free. Everyone just needs to say no to that, and eventually they'll stop offering free work, basically.
I think as well.
Serena, Emma, what would you say, Serena, if someone said, and it was a commission that you were particularly interested in creatively, but they said, I'll cover your, for a magazine, I'll cover your costs, all your shoot expenses?
Yeah, if it was something that depends how much I loved it, the idea of it, but I would probably be like, I need like 15, 20 rolls of film to do this. And like, just, I don't know, it's tough without it being a specific thing. I tried to say no, but if it's something that I really, really want to shoot, then I'll have to do it.
Yeah.
But just make sure that I can do it exactly the way that I want to. Otherwise, it's not worth it for me at all.
I think as well, for all the people that will try and just offer you exposure, there are a lot of jobs that will pay you, places that do have budget. It's easy to lose sight of that, but there are definitely those jobs out there.
Yeah.
I'm sure you found that, Serena.
100%.
Yeah. I mean, way more than not now.
Yeah.
Which is nice to see. And if they are offering exposure, it's usually for a reason that I can understand. Doesn't necessarily justify it, but it makes sense, rather than them just literally trying to mug you off, or just saying I have no budget, which is like it's probably not true. So yeah, it's good. It's definitely like changing, but there's definitely a lot more work to be done.
And just coming in from a kind of organisational perspective, Arts Council want artists to be paid all the time. That's kind of like a real criteria. And so if you're ever creating a budget, or as the Photographers Gallery, we have to pay artists. There's no doubt about that. So there is sort of, things are shifting from that sort of level, but obviously it's solidarity on the ground as well by saying no is important.
Yeah, I agree.
Someone has asked, if you get an internship but they say it's unpaid, how do you tell them it's illegal, that you need to be paid, without the company turning around and offering it to someone else? Stephen, I feel like you would be very firm in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, we don't do unpaid intern. I can't imagine. Yeah, I mean, again, it's illegal under the terms of the law. So I can't really imagine who that would be. But yeah, I mean, how do you say no on the grounds that it is illegal? I mean, I guess again, to Serena's point, it's about just being, I suppose, direct but polite in your response. I mean, it's up to you as an individual as to whether you want to take action against that in any way, and I don't know what the appropriate channels would be to report that, but companies should be paying the minimum wage and better the London living wage, absolutely, as a minimum for any form of internship. So I would be highly suspect, and if you are going to respond, I'd just be fairly direct and kind of give your point of view on that.
I think Serena is right. You said that the unpaid internship you did had much less interest in investing in you as a person.
There was much value in it, in terms of like my time, or like, I don't think they even asked to see my work or anything. Like it was just pretty much like, that's your desk and here's what I need you to do. So yeah, I think just take things that they say with a pinch of salt, because if they're not willing to give you anything from the start, I don't know if they would give you anything at the end either. So it's probably not worth it.
There's a weird irony to that, isn't there? That the ones that are worth doing, you actually get paid for. I mean, there's an actual exchange happening there. If you're a company and you're paying someone to be an intern, then you want return for the thing that you're paying for. Whereas if you're not paying someone, there's less of an obligation for you. You are sadly less of a, you're more throwaway as I suppose in some senses, because you can have as many unpaid interns as you want, and there were probably fashion magazines in the 90s and the noughties who had 15 interns working for free for years with no prospect of progression or respect. So I think as soon as people start trading something, they want value for that salary. I mean, that's the way that this whole model works, right? Someone told me very early doors that if someone's paying you, it's because they charge your services out to someone else and make money from you. It's like that social media thing. If you're not paying for it, you're the product. So I think there's a very simple equation there. The companies who pay interns you're going to get a more beneficial, well, at least in your experience, Serena, experience of working there. You're going to take more from it.
A lot of places, I think, kind of churn through free interns as well, to do like this constant workload that they have, but they don't want to hire anyone to do. So you can fall into that trap as well. So it's probably not worth it.
Max has asked, if the pay is undisclosed, what's the nicest way to ask for it? Serena, how would you?
I usually just say like, how much budget do you have for my fee? That's like, I wasn't really sure myself. I've just started saying that, so I hope it's right, but they tell me afterwards, so I think so.
Something that I found as a journalist, I know it's a kind of different profession altogether, but just tell people what you want, and a lot of the time people will pay you that. If you tell them that's what it's going to cost, they'll be like, oh, okay, and then they'll pay you it.
Yeah, that's true.
Sophie's asked how you handle close friends and family asking for favors, freebies, or mates rates.
I mean, that's probably quite excruciating, is it?
I mean, I'm still doing that all the time, to be honest. No, to be honest, I don't mind doing it to an extent with my friends and my family. It's obviously not work that I love to do, but I mean, you can just make up excuses as well, like I do, especially with Corona. Like, you can actually say, I have to self-isolate at the moment. That's been like a big one for me. But yeah, I think, I don't know if that, well, I can't speak from experience of overcoming that. Like, I still do that all the time, so I'm sorry, I don't really have a proper answer.
I think that's one of the first instances of a benefit of COVID I've ever heard. Sophie just say I'm self-isolating. It's actually brilliant. When photographers have agents, they just get the agents to call back the friend and say, oh, sorry, yeah, job's just come in. That's really unfortunate. Sorry, she's just... yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky one, that one, isn't it? I mean, I think, you know, the other thing is that most artists develop a network and peers that are working as stylists and art directors, and, you know, people who go off and start their own things. And I think there has to be a level of, but that's a value exchange. That's a different thing. You know, there's a different, again, it's someone you know, you have a relationship with. You probably are going to, you know, be developing at a similar pace to them at some point in the future. I'm not talking about shooting your mate's wedding, but I'm sort of like, you know, I think there's probably a lot of value in it for you as a photographer of it doing people favors when you know that hopefully at some point when they are creative director of Nike in Portland, they'll give you one back.
Emma's asked where you start when you're pricing your work, because she did a commission after graduating, felt confident about pricing it, but once she'd finished and got through the materials, felt like she'd undercharged massively. Sad face. Oh, Emma. Is that, Serena, I feel like maybe that's just kind of experience over time. You know, you get an intuitive feel for how much you should be charging and how much time and how many materials a project will take.
Yeah, 100%. I was just going to say, like, I'm even still learning as I go, but I feel like with every job that comes, you kind of have a takeaway in terms of like, oh my God, I can't believe I did all that work for nothing, or like, wow, someone's actually offering me like £1 gazillion to do this. I did it for free last week. So yeah, I think it is just an experience thing, but always go high. Don't be scared, because I'm always too scared. I'm like, I don't know, they might say no, but yeah, like the worst thing I can do is say no, and then you just have to learn to negotiate. But yeah.
Caroline has said, if you've already brought up the minimal pay and they refuse with no other work in sight, do you take it? I feel like you stick to your guns.
Yeah.
To be honest.
If that, like you've said, it's your minimum for a reason, right? So like, it's your minimum. You've told them that. So otherwise they're just going to continue to not pay you what you want to be paid. Next time they might come back and be like, oh, okay, so she said no to this last time, so this time we'll actually go back with a reasonable offer. So that's what you want. You want like your fee to build up, and you want to be paid more the more you develop as well. So yeah, just say no.
I feel like you can feel quite resentful doing a job if you feel like it's really underpaid. You know, you're
that's another reason why I can't really do much like underpaid work, because I just hate it. Like, I'll spend the whole shoot day being super miserable, and then I'll be editing the photos in a bad mood, and then like, yeah, it just doesn't make you feel good about yourself. So yeah, it's not worth it.
So question for both of you, I think. Susanna and Josie have asked how you set an hourly price that reflects the value you provide to the client. that also takes into account hidden costs. So things like holiday pay, sick pay, and if you've ever added editing images as an extra price.
You're probably better at answering that, Serena. But I mean, just from my experience of having been a photo agent for a bit as well, what you try and do from not having been a photographer, obviously professional photographer myself, but you do try and establish a fee, which is literally your fee to perform the service. So your fee to turn up on the shoot day and take the pictures, and you have to just evaluate each job really, and depending on what is required of you. So if there's a job which requires a huge amount of post-production or an excessive amount of pre-production, usually you'd figure out as part of your sort of toolkit of how I'm going to charge myself, like what a kind of half-day rate is for pre-production or a half-day rate is for post-production. And you want to try and, as much as possible, wherever you can for commercial jobs, separate out the usage, because the usage is, you as a photographer, you own the copyright, you own the image. And the usage is the way the photographers obviously derive value from their work. And so trying to keep the actual usage of the image separate from your fee, which is the thing you literally turn up on the day and take the pictures and provide the images, for me has always been a helpful kind of guide for photographers. But then in terms of holiday pay, sick pay, etc., it's quite an interesting point now, isn't it? The hidden costs of being a photographer. I mean, same with directors. I often think a bit like Olympic athletes, you spend 95% of your year of training on the track, and then 5% actually kind of running around in front of everyone. With photographers and directors, so much of your year can be spent on building yourself, investing in yourself, running your portfolio, editing, doing all of those things. So you have to make sure that the work you're actually doing kind of compensates for that time as well, which is what's probably so annoying about being a photographer and someone going 350 quid for a day rate. Well, we usually only pay 200. You're like, it's the only day of work I've done this month. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. I think I would steer clear of hourly rates, because even half day rates are still a bit iffy in my opinion, because although you might be doing a half day, you're not going to leave and go and do another job probably for the second half of the day. Like, it does eat up your whole day financially of like working. So yeah, I would definitely charge for the project, or potentially per day, whatever works out more money in your head, depending on the project obviously. But yeah, stay away from hourly, because you'll end up they'll be like, okay, we'll have you for like 20 minutes then, and then or like they'll be like watching their clock the whole time you're shooting. So yeah, just don't bother. You either book for a day or don't bother.
Yasin's asked a good question about licensing. They say that there's conflicting information online that doesn't always account for smaller publications or brands. When should photographers charge licensing fees beyond the fees for production?
I feel like Stephen should answer this, because I don't
licensing licensing in terms of reuse of the image. I'm guessing that's what you mean, Yasin. So essentially, if you're shooting a picture for a magazine of a personality and it's to appear in, I don't know, Dazed, you've been commissioned to take a picture of a musician or an actor, let's say, and you are giving them, and there should be a contract, which there should, actually most editorial titles, either a contract which is an email or an actual contract saying this is what we have the usage of this image for. Like, they will not be able to relicense that image, use it in overseas editions, or obviously sell on the usage of that image. 100%, that should be a separate thing. So you should never be. When should photographers charge license fees beyond the fee for production? I mean, as a photographer, you retain the copyright. So if you want to then use a separate third-party image library, let's say, you should be within your rights to list your images there and be able to gain further usage from the sale of those images. It's not something which should ever be retained. And you have to watch this, actually. There's one very big global publishing company in particular I know of that is trying to ask photographers to sign contracts, which basically gives them the ability to be able to reuse their images in future without any further payment. So you have to be really, really careful and actually read that stuff and make sure that if there are terms and conditions attached to your, whether it's your commission note or the contract you've sent, that you're actually reading that, because you want to make sure that you're just giving the usage for the intended commission, especially if there's not really a budget attached to that. But same for advertising. I mean, in the main campaigns, it's very specific. It's 6 months, print, out of home, digital, online, social. That's it. Once that expires, you're then into renegotiation for further usage.
I think we just have time for one more question before we finish. So I'm just going to leap to this question about how you find commissioners that will pay you if you're new to the industry and not necessarily in London. Just a small question to finish with.
Yeah, good question. So I couldn't answer the London thing because I do live in London and I don't really work outside of London either. But I'd say in terms of like, you can kind of go two ways. You can either reach out to people that you want to work for. You'll probably send out like 1 million emails and not really get any response, but it can be good because, you know, you're in their brain. If something pops up, like a job, and they're like, oh, who can I get to see? Oh, this person emailed me, like that might be a good fit. That can work, but not loads. I tend to focus my time and my energy into my Instagram and my website and making sure that looks professional and making sure it looks like I know what I'm doing if you were to hire me, basically. So yeah, I would probably focus a lot on like making sure people can actually see your work and find it and love it so that they will commission you. I don't know, what do you think, Stephen?
I think that's probably a really good example. I mean, I remember going to stand in news agents and just flicking through and finding the picture editor of all the magazines that I liked, and then just kind of reaching out. And I do agree with you, Serena, that no one should be disheartened if they don't receive responses to emails from picture editors. It's really easy to feel like, oh, well, I just spent my entire morning constructing the perfect email, which is going to win over this person's heart. People just receive so much communication, they just often don't respond to those things. But, you know, just being really succinct and being like, love the title, this is where I'm based, would love to shoot this for you, and then having a couple of signature images in, will log in people's brains, and just keeping people kind of, you know, not weekly updates like, hey, it's me again, but just kind of keeping people updated with, you know, new creative projects that you're really excited by. Those things, they eventually pay off, and then you develop the relationship, and then it kind of goes from there. But I think that Instagram has changed everything, and I think it really, really has. I think, you know, photographers should be spending a huge amount of time just making sure they're really happy with the way they're presenting on Instagram, because it's just becoming this massive medium for commissioning, isn't it? It's huge now, absolutely huge. Pretty soon photo agencies won't know what to, you know, do you know what I mean? Like, individual photographers have such huge followings in terms of their personal social media channels. So, and that's all good advice.
I think we've come to the end now. Is that right, Jelly? We are out of time?
Yeah, we're 3 minutes over, but some brilliant questions and such insightful answers as well. Honestly, I'm so glad we recorded this because there's some just seriously good takeaways that I think everyone can kind of apply and think about when they're approaching getting work and you know, being asked to work for free or for little money. I was actually going to mention that tomorrow, I didn't plan this on purpose, but we have a talk, a money talk, which is going to be talking more broadly about how to sort of manage your finances as freelancers. It won't specifically say like how much you should get for a photographic job, because it's by Amelia Bennett, who is sort of more like a financial person in general, but I think it would be a really nice follow on from this, just to get, it's about talking openly about money and having the confidence to do so. I think it's really, really important. But I just want to say a huge thank you so much, Emma, Serena and Stephen, for such incredible information and advice. And yeah, I hope everyone's got some good takeaways they can apply to their own experience.